Alright, so hello and welcome back. It has been a while, yes? So today we're going to react to Germany Could Not Win World War II by Potential History. I'll link the video in the description, go check it out. I'll also link my Patreon if you are a D&D person or like to support this channel and get some benefits, you can go there. But this topic should be pretty interesting. Know quite a lot about World War II. Kind of interested in what he's going to say, so without further ado, we shall get to it.
There, I've finished fine-tuning my what-if machine. It can answer any what-if question accurate to within 1/10 of a plausibility unit. Who wants the machine to show them an alternate reality?
Oh, I want to know.
If Germany wins, if Hitler stops making decisions.
Who else has a question for the what-if machine? I have one.
Do they win if they mass produce the mouse tank?
Make that machine show me what would happen
if they took Moscow.
That's so
Yeah, pretty much. All of those events I agree with. Mass production wouldn't change the war. Taking Moscow wouldn't change the war unless Stalin killed himself or died somehow. Yeah, probably not going to happen. And yeah, just how it would be.
plausible, I can't believe it.
People love rooting for the underdog. These stories strike a chord with us at a very basic level, and you can tell this by how popular these stories are in media. This also translates to real-world stories, although real life does not have a plot that always turns in the underdog's favor. So there's this kind of romanticism connected to fighting for a lost cause that a lot of people assign to a lot of real-world groups. One of these you see talked about a lot is the German army in World War II, that if only dumb Hitler hadn't been in charge, or if different choices were made, that the war would have turned out different. And a lot of these arguments seem to hold water on the surface, but upon reflection, mostly miss the point or do not make a significant enough change to sway anything. These are my favorite how Germany could have won scenarios, and how they're wrong. I hear this one all the time, that if the Germans had just driven onto Moscow and taken it, the Russians would have capitulated. But it is rarely backed up with evidence as to why. Even in the memoirs of German generals after the war, they constantly mention that the drive to Moscow would have meant victory in the East. And I think the reason for this is that they model the Russian campaign after the French campaign. In the French campaign in 1940, the French surrender once Paris is cut off from its forces and looks like it's about to fall. Using this model, a lot of people think that the exact same would apply to Russia. The only problem with this is Russia is a whole different animal, both politically and geographically. Stalin was going to put every man, woman, and child in the Soviet Union between him and the advancing Germans, and this is exemplified by the way the Red Army fought the war, often trading casualties for time. So if Moscow is...
So, yes, Stalin would have put every man, woman, and child in front of him to stop the Germans, okay? France wasn't willing to do that. France had suffered enormously from the Great War, okay? Their political willpower to actually continue a war in the way the Soviets did was not there, okay? They weren't willing to sacrifice that much. The French did fight, and they put up a valiant effort, but when all of your army is encircled, it's pretty much over. It's like what happened in Dunkirk. Their army got surrounded, all their good troops, and it was gone at that point. You can't fight with an army that doesn't exist. But to the point, yeah, the Soviet Union was a completely different animal. Even if you do the example of taking Paris from the French, right? That was because they had encircled their entire army and it was dead at that point, and then they surrendered after that, right? Continue fighting after actually for a good while. And then if you did it for Moscow, the Soviets aren't going to surrender. There's no real way I would think that they would actually surrender. There would have to be some wacky shenanigans with Stalin somehow dying. And remember, he's a totalitarian dictator, and he killed everyone that opposed him by this point. So, not really going to happen.
was taken, sure, it's a political and also logistical defeat, given that the rail network was centered around it, but no way do I think Stalin is just going to shrug and say, well, we tried, after Moscow was taken. And with that, we would probably see the Soviet Union fighting to the bitter end, just like the Germans did in reality.
I agree. Even if they took Moscow, and even if they continued fighting past that, all the way to the Ural Mountains, I don't think the Soviet Union is giving up.
This is also backed up by real-world history from Napoleon's Russia campaign in 1812, where he went on to take Moscow but still lost the war.
This is true, but the main capital was St. Petersburg at the time, so the historic capital Moscow was at that time.
Russia is such a large and vast country that they have the ability to trade casualties and land at a higher rate than any other country can. and therefore the normal rules of war such as taking the capital and ensuring victory do not apply.
Are they not seeing this?
Yeah, I don't see where people say that taking the capital ends war. If you took the capital of the United States, you took DC. Oh well, it's DC. It has a population of 500,000, right? There's a big difference between taking a capital and that's like an actual capital city, like DC. And the capital of Turkey is actually inland. It's in the middle of the country. I can't remember the name. It's escaping me. So start with something with an A, right? But it is a capital city. Okay, but the difference between Paris and DC is that Paris is a capital city along with being the largest city, right? So it would be like if somebody took New York City and it was the capital. There's a little play there.
Another commonly heard point is that Hitler made terrible decisions and he should have just listened to his generals. Now, I'm not here to defend Adolf Hitler, he's a crazy genocidal maniac, let's not make two ways about it. But this isn't always the case. For example, Hitler and the High Command were all in agreement on invading Russia. They all very much wanted to, in their eyes, destroy communism and save Germany, as Hitler laid out in his book. But once this effort was undertaken, Hitler and his generals began to disagree at times on what moves needed to be made. And once the war is over, many generals in their memoirs begin to claim that Hitler made all the bad decisions, and that if he had just listened to them, the war would have been won. And
that even happens today, okay? That's nothing new.
Example of this I already hinted at in the former point. Hitler's generals were convinced that taking Moscow would end the war for many erroneous reasons I listed previously. For Hitler, Moscow was a general direction in which to head, but was not the final objective. For him, the resources in the Ukraine and the oil fields beyond were a much more important target. And given Germany's oil shortages, this is a good example of where Hitler was right and his generals were wrong. And actually, a lot of Hitler's so-called mistakes start to make a whole lot more sense once you put it into the context of Germany's fuel shortages. And if you want more information on this, Tick did an excellent video on Germany's oil problem that you should really check out.
I agree, you should go watch that. It's very long, but it gives you a very in-depth explanation on it, okay? Tick is a very good historian when it comes to numbers and facts like this. But yes, going on to the point that Germany's oil problem was basically one of their downfalls, okay? The Axis had an oil problem in general. Germany had one for their army. Italy had one for their navy because they couldn't basically sail because they didn't have any. And Japan had the exact same thing for their navy in the Pacific.
Another example of this sentiment being wrong is Operation Citadel in 1943. Hitler's generals convinced him that an attack on the Kursk Bulge would cripple the Red Army and renew Germany's initiative in the war. Hitler saw this plan as very flawed, though, famously saying, "Every time I think about Operation Citadel, my stomach turns over."
Operation Citadel is the Battle of Kursk that we remember today, the biggest tank battle that ever happened, and was a stunning defeat for Germany, okay? There are many reasons why this attack failed. Mainly, the Soviets knew they were coming, and they prepared, and Germany kept delaying, and delaying, and delaying, and combine this with a whole bunch of factors like the Red Army was actually getting itself organized now and defensive layers, and they also knew the Germans were coming in the direction they were coming. It led to a massacre on the German side, and it also led to high casualties on the Soviets, but they could take it and they were able to hold out.
And seeing how poorly this turned out for the Germans, his premonition was eerily correct. Now, if this was the caricature of Hitler always overriding his generals that is commonly seen, Citadel would have been called off before it was launched. Now, these are just two quick examples, and yes, there are times, especially later in the war, where Hitler overrules his generals with poor decisions. The Battle of the Bulge comes to mind.
So yeah, it's basically after 43 and then 44, 45, where Hitler just assumes basically direct command of the military, and he tells the generals to basically get bent. And he's doing everything at that point. But before then, 42, 43, 41, 40, 39, he was leaving a lot of the decisions up to the generals on how they wanted to pursue it, and he would override, of course, just like FDR and Churchill and pretty much any other leader would.
But early in the war, when these decisions really count, Hitler is many times making the right decisions when overruling his generals, or going along with them in agreement of a common goal. So, Hitler should have just listened to his generals and he would have won the war, is a moot point. Because many times he did, and his generals were wrong, and many times he didn't, and he turned out to be right.
It's all Adolf Hitler, Adolf Hitler, Adolf Hitler.
This is actually a point I used to subscribe to. A very honest critique of the German war economy is that it was not on the right footing. And people make this argument usually saying things like, Germany should have just made more Panzer IVs instead of pouring resources into the Tiger. Or, Germany should have built the Luftwaffe back up so they could regain air superiority. And I will give you that the German war economy in many places was an absolute nightmare. John Parshall does an excellent lecture on tank production in World War II and really highlights how backwards the German production process was for armored vehicle manufacturing, and mentions how that knowledge can be applied to other types of war manufacturing. And although one...
Yeah, I've watched that video too. It's pretty good. And he talks about the tank manufacturing there. But this applies to everything Germany was doing, okay? Everything over there was highly complex, and it was not really simplified, okay? Their war industry was in total shambles from a production standpoint, okay? When Albert Speer took over in 1943, it started to actually streamline and get better, right? Even with the strategic bombing the Allies were doing, they were increasing production, which is kind of a miracle, right? But you have to think, the reason we have so many technological developments from World War II is because of the Germans, okay? Assault rifle, jet technology, advanced submarines, okay? All of those came from Germany. And the reason this was because they couldn't focus. They had a number of projects they were doing, Wunderwaffe, right? Wonder weapons. And they focused on a whole bunch of varieties of things, right, that they thought could work. So that they could never streamline and focus on a specific production line, right? So like America, even in World War II, we had a problem of producing M1 Grands. That's why the Marines had Springfield rifles on Guadalcanal, okay? And even then, when we hyper-focused on the Grand production, it was only frontline troops that got it. Everyone else in the back line got carbines, pistols, and sometimes Springfields, right? But that ability to hyper-focus on a specific equipment was just not what Germany was doing, okay? They built Tiger 1s, Tiger 2s, Mouses. They built a whole bunch of different vehicles, okay? Because their production needed, because of necessity and to convert vehicles, and also because they wanted to explore different options, okay? All I'm saying here is basically Germany paved the way for prototyping pretty much everything, but at the same time, it also lost their production by doing that.
Once Speer takes over, production is streamlined to a degree, and munitions and weapons production goes up year by year. It's not near where it needs to be to fight this attritional war. So obviously, the solution is to just streamline production, sort of how you see in the American model, and this would have given Germany a better chance in the war. Although this is a good criticism, it misses the core issue. The biggest thing Germany was running low on from 1942 onward is, as I mentioned before, oil, and larger numbers of tanks and planes wouldn't be any good if there was no fuel to run them. Also, Germany was having manpower shortages as early as 1942 or 43, and along with fuel to run...
That's very important to remember, because the German army in 1939 was one of the best in the world, okay? The reason for this was because the Reichswehr was a very professional army and was very small, okay? Now, this did lead to problems later when they had to expand, and guys jumped 2 to 3 ranks above their current station, and they had a whole bunch of new guys. But the army in 39 and 40 had been built up slowly, and that army was very, very good at its job, okay? They streaked through Poland. After Poland, they blitzed France, okay? Those were your veteran troops. In 1941 for Barbarossa, those veteran troops were able to blitz a massive amount of territory in the Soviet Union and overrun positions, okay? But those troops start to die, get sick, and become casualties, okay? When that happens, you start to get replacements, okay? And as he said, in 41, 42, Germany was starting to have replacement issues, okay? Because, again, those troops that you're losing are very valuable, okay? You can't just train a dude with a rifle and throw him at a machine gun. I mean, you can, and you can look at the Soviet Union and how that worked. But if you want actual effective combat troops, you need to train them, and they need to be professional soldiers, and that takes time, and you can't replace those losses. Contrary to many beliefs, you can't replace those losses, okay? Germany was taking them massively during Barbarossa. So were the Soviets, okay? But they had more manpower, and they could trade for time, okay? That's just one thing to keep in mind.
On these machines, you need people to crew them. These are just 2 issues that cannot be remedied by streamlining production. At a certain point, Germany's just going to be out of oil and out of men, and no amount of additional tanks or planes would operationally be possible.
What's the matter? Run out of gas?
Kinda embarrassing.
Well, I don't know what he's going to say, but this is never going to happen. Not in our timeline, at least, unless someone intervenes.
This is another point that deceptively seems to make a lot of sense, as Germany was crushed by a two-front war. It stands to reason that if Japan and Germany through their alliance had coordinated an attack on Russia, they would have won. And that may honestly be true.
That actually may be half decently true. They'd have to change a whole bunch of things with Japan later, but it might actually.
A big boost to the defense of Moscow came after Russian troops from Siberia were sent west after the Russo-Japanese Non-Aggression Pact. The only problem with this is that coordination did not and was never going to happen. Germany and Japan were allies by circumstance and shared no real common goals with each other. And in fact, they're operating in opposition to each other at times.
This is true, okay? Germany and Japan really had no strategic interest in allying each other on Russia, right? Like, what was Japan trying to get? Resources. Where is that? Not in the north, in Siberia, okay? At least for the resources they wanted, which was oil. That's why they went to the South Pacific with the rubber and the oil, right? Germany wanted to take Russia out because communism, right? And their oil was closer to them in Europe. So they didn't work together.
German training of Chinese troops in the 30s as they were fighting the Japanese is a direct example of this.
This is true, and the German divisions that were actually trained on how to fight were very good. Problem was, they all died.
In short, neither side was going to stick out its neck for the other. In fact, Russia as a common enemy was probably the only instance in which they would have, and even then they did not. The reason for Japan not wanting to do this is mostly colored by the Japanese experience against the Soviets at the Battle of Konkangal, please forgive my pronunciation, where the Red Army gave the Imperial Army a very bloody nose in an undeclared border conflict. This incident convinced the Japanese to not go through with any action that would provoke the Soviet Union, as they did not want war with them, since they were already fighting China and would soon be fighting the United States. This avoidance of provoking the Soviet Union went far enough that during the war in the Pacific between Japan and the United States, the Japanese refused to sink any U.S. merchant ships headed to the Soviet Union. So, the Japanese attacking the Soviet Union...
And also, the American pilots, if I remember correctly, after the Doolittle raid, some of them landed in the Soviet Union, and they were detained, but the Soviets, to their credit, were like, ha! Oh no, the prisoners escaped near Iran. Oh no, what will we do? And they made it to Iran, and then from Iran they made it back to America. And they also, on the same token, detained pilots that landed in their borders on a B-29, and they're like, ah, yes, this will be called the Tu-22 or Tu-23. I can't remember. The Soviet ripoff of the B-29.
Union directly flies in the face of the intentions and characteristics of the Japanese High Command, to the point where it strays out of potential history,
Kill yourself.
into the realm of fantasy.
You have screwed me again. Japan.
I agree, right? Japan, the only time they probably would have worked with Germany was to take the Soviet Union down. And even then they didn't. And if they declared war on the Soviet Union at the same time as they were fighting America, it would literally be suicide. They'd be fighting the Soviets on a land war. They'd be fighting China. They'd be fighting everyone in the Pacific. They'd be fighting America. They weren't going to win that war. The only way I could see it possibly working is if they went with Plan North and attacked the Soviets at the same time Germany did. But that would require them to work together. And that wasn't going to happen with Germany.
This is my favorite one. If they had just made insert ridiculous design here.
Yeah, these are all very good. That's actually the mouse. And yeah, 100 ton tank. Yeah.
The war may have gone differently, and it's the idea that this thing, or this thing, or this thing would somehow have single-handedly lengthened the war. There are a few fan favorites for pics of these. The one I see most often being the mouse, the ridiculous 200-ton behemoth that in reality would have been awesome target practice for Allied fighter bombers and something for Allied soldiers to gawk at once it had run out of fuel and had to be abandoned. Or German jet aircraft, that although cutting edge and superior to what the Allies had, still couldn't have been applied in a large scale due to the aforementioned fuel and personnel problems.
They also had material problems, because jet engines were requiring specific metals, and they didn't have them. And it led to their engines blowing out after 24 hours, okay? The Arado 234, if I remember correctly. That's the recon aircraft. Now, that one was specifically used for recon, and it did have the advantages of being very fast, and you could fly low, or you could fly high with this recon aircraft and avoid detection. But again, we're talking so minuscule numbers here that it's not going to change the war, right? Allied had over 50,000 aircraft from Normandy, right? And Luftwaffe was like, yeah, we're not winning. Yeah, so yeah.
And the list for these things goes on and on. A personal pet peeve of mine in this category is the what-if question about the German atomic program, and the claim that if they had applied themselves, the Germans could have come up with an atomic weapon first. This
I don't know what he's going to say, but there's literally no way Germany would be able to get a bomb before the United States.
notion, though, just like that of Japan invading Russia, very quickly falls into the category of fantasy once looked at for three main reasons. One, many of Germany's top scientists were expelled in the 30s for being Jewish, automatically limiting German atomic capabilities. And actually, many of these scientists went on to work in the American nuclear program. So to make this win scenario work, you automatically have to make the Nazis tolerant of Jews, which is not going to happen. Two, the German atomic program is all but cancelled by 1942. As Speer put it, we got the view that the development was very much at the beginning. The physicists themselves didn't want to put much into it.
This is true. It also happened in Norway because they did the raid on the heavy water plants and blew all those up, right? To go to the Norwegian commandos there, and the British commandos that also did that. But yeah, Germany getting an atomic program is literally fantasy land. The United States put like 20% of our entire power, all of our power, 20% of it into the Manhattan Project. And we were not isolation. We were completely away from being bombed. And it still took us till 1945 to get this project, to start dropping the bombs. There was no way Germany was getting a bomb before us.
Which works into my third point, that Hitler saw atomic science as Jewish science, and pointed the focus of German development towards conventional weapons. So we're not even talking about an atomic race between the US and Germany, as it was barely being pursued by the Germans. And to give a what-if scenario about it would fly directly in the face of what Hitler stood for. And this gets into the bigger problem with this question, that even if Germany does produce these wonder weapons and extends the war, it's only going to extend it long enough to be the first country to get nuked, due to the Germany First policy of the Allies.
Are you making a
Jet plane.
or remote control the
That is true. When he says Germany First policy, that was the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviets all agreeing that Germany was a priority target. All three agreed that no matter what, they would focus their resources and intentions on Germany. Okay, and I think this is before the Tehran conference. United States was doing it, but after the Tehran conference, if I remember correctly, all of them agreed after Germany's down, the Soviets will attack the Japanese a month later. 30 days later, they will attack Japan and help finish them off. So yeah, Germany First policy is everyone works together, take Germany down. After Germany's down, we'll then focus on other enemies, basically Japan at that point.
Super soldier.
Or is it just another dumb
Tank.
Now these are just a handful of points that people bring up when talking about how Germany could have won, but there are many more that I didn't go into that are equally baseless, such as the Germans should have and could have invaded England, even
Yeah, that wasn't gonna fucking happen, I'll put it that way.
though the Kriegsmarine would not be able to support a large amphibious attack, and the much larger Royal Navy would have probably sunk the invading force before it even reached the shores. Or,
Not even just sunk. Obliterated was more of the term. And even if Germany sent the Tirpitz, we're Fantasyland, okay? Even if the Germans sent the Tirpitz, the Bismarck, the Scharnhorst, the Gneisenau, and the Panzerschiefs, all of them somehow don't die in 1940 and 39. We're in Fantasyland now. And sent them into the Channel. The British Royal Navy's plan to stop the invasion was to send the entire Royal Navy into the Channel, regardless of the casualties that they would take to stop an invasion. That was the determination and the will of the Royal Navy. Okay, they were willing to lose everything to stop an invasion. There's no way Germany is invading. Even if they get a foothold, which is saying something, they can't resupply because they'll be continuously bombed and shelled from the British Navy. You're in Fantasyland if you think Sea Lion was ever going to work.
or that Barbarossa should have taken place earlier, even though it wasn't really the winter or the rainy season that stopped the Germans, it was a lack of supplies that needed to be brought up.
I kind of agree on that, okay? So Barbarossa, they'd run out of supplies was basically the ultimate downfall of that. However, they did launch it very late. Very late. And that did cause problems because your operational window is minus basically 2 months. Would that have changed it? No. Would have helped some soldiers not freeze to death? Maybe. They probably just would have lost Stalingrad earlier is probably what would have happened. But again, we're just in Fantasyland now.
For more info on that, check out this lecture by David Stahill. You'll see people bringing up scenario after scenario that bends reality and character motivations very widely to craft a scenario that Germany could win. But here's my point. Germany would not have won World War II no matter what way you slice it.
I agree with him. No matter what way you slice it, Germany is not winning World War II at all. If it goes anywhere near our timeline, they're not winning this war. Okay, if they declare one of the Soviet Unions, they're not winning this war at all.
The fact of the matter is, this is a country that is too small and too short on resources to take on the 3 largest world powers at once.
Yep. Basically said what I... Yep.
Especially given the erroneous actions and motivations they have. Basically, the Germans dealt themselves a bad hand and played it poorly. And the only way that's going to change is if you bend time and space to their liking with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight. All things that are not going to happen in reality.
Okay, so that's the video there. Again, very, very good. Yeah, so again, I'll just recap. Germany was not going to win the war. They attacked 3 world powers at the same time. There's no way they were going to win that. It's fantasyland to think that that was going to happen. Even if they coordinate with Japan, it's still a slim possibility that they might have pulled it off. And I mean might, against the Soviet Union. But again, I don't really think so. But if you guys found this video interesting, you know, go ahead, leave a like, leave a comment. Check out my Patreon if you want to do voting for reaction videos. Otherwise, I will see you people next time.